and thank Gotham Comedy Club. We had a SIA fundraiser comedy night. It was a blast. It was a lot of fun, and the comics came out, and it was raining, so it was pouring rain, and they came out anyway, so I just really appreciate them. And National City Trophy donated the trophies that you'll see on Sunday. Anaheim Signs made the great banner that you see behind you and any signage that you see. But I want to say Steve designed the banner, which is very cool, right? Zombie Blast Energy Shot. Every energy shot that's sold, they give us a percentage, which is great. TDE Marketing and Consulting, that's Steve, and the Pod Brother. And NYC Zombie Crawl, they're going to be participating in the demonstration. Another little bit of housekeeping that I want to go over is when you're in a convention or a surrounding like this and you are around survivors, there's some things that you need to be aware of, and we want to keep this event as uplifting and happy and healing and beautiful as possible. So I'm just going to read some things that will help you maybe feel more comfortable and those around you, okay? Each survivor and supporter comes to see a convention with different needs, hopes, and boundaries. In order to ensure every attendee is able to contribute with the highest level of comfort, we ask a few considerations be observed. Many survivors are triggered by physical contact. Please be considerate of this when approaching others. So, maybe ask, hey, can I give you a hug? Can I shake your hand? Survivors come from various religious, political, and social backgrounds. In order to help everyone heal and feel safe as possible, please respect each individual's orientations by keeping conversations specific and avoiding open generalizations that may be perceived as judgmental towards a particular religion, political party, sexual orientation, or other social groups. In order to protect each survivor's privacy, please ask before taking pictures or videos of any of the attendees. Now, I know this is going to be blasted all over Facebook, so just know that up front, that we're live streaming. We're going to be posting things on Facebook. So if you don't want, raise your hand and say, I don't want my picture taken. And that's okay, by the way. If you don't want your picture taken, that's perfectly fine. Regardless of your personal feelings towards any issue discussed, please be careful not to express judgment or criticism of any kind to other attendees or discount any memories or experiences that they might have had. Those are their experiences, and let them own those, okay? Please be respectful of other attendees' need to be alone or private. Please do not prod attendees to remain involved in conversations or disclose information they may not feel comfortable speaking about. And it's completely acceptable to step outside the room at any time for as long as you need. I understand this. I've done it myself a few times. This is a very emotional topic, and when you just need to step away. It's okay. It's perfectly okay. The next thing that I want to mention is I myself am a survivor. I come from a religious boarding school, and that place has since been closed down. Actually got closed down 2 years ago due to reporting of that facility and several others there in Florida. And that was done by Alexandria Zayas, and she is a passionate reporter, and she made that happen. So raising this awareness and bringing this to the public does work and does make a difference. So, part of the reason why we're doing this is, empowerment for the survivors and helping that journey of healing by speaking out, but also raising that awareness so this doesn't happen to another child. You know what you went through. You don't want to have another child go through that same thing. So telling your story, standing up, being proud to be a survivor, that's why we're here. So, lastly, I want to, there's a goodie bag, and in the goodie bag there is a CD, and this was donated by a lady named Janice, and all of the songs are very uplifting, healing, and encouraging, and there's a couple that are signed that we're going to raffle off a little bit later, and I urge you to listen to this CD. It's really a beautiful CD. So, and she donated all of them to the convention. So thank you so much, Janice. And then there's a bracelet, which is great. So everybody should have theirs on. And then we have a little brochure postcard. And then a couple business cards. And then everybody should have their little registration badge. If you don't have one, please come see me. And inside the little folder there's some business cards, and that's my business card and Steve's business card. So if you need anything, please, don't be afraid to come up to me. I promise I won't bite that hard. So without further ado, I would like to introduce a man who I myself don't know very well, but I'm really looking forward to getting to know. Dr. Strozier. How I actually came across him was I was doing some research on the internet about the cult experience, and I ran across a video of him on the Oprah network. And I was very impressed by what he had to say, and I said, I wonder if he'll come and speak at my... So I timidly called him and said, hi. And he, without hesitation, said, sure, I'll be there, no problem. And, of course, I was shocked and awed, and I'm so thankful so much, Dr. Strozier, for coming out and sharing this knowledge with us. So without any further ado, Dr. Strozier.
Do you want this at this angle? So thank you very much. It's a delight to be here. Sort of fools' names and fools' faces are always found in public places. So the more you write these days, the more you end up on the internet, for better or worse. But in this case, definitely for better. And it really is. I'm very honored to be here. I've got my bracelet on, and I want to share with you some thoughts on what is a rather large title. I don't know if you have it in the program, but I call this the Fundamentalist Mindset, Totalistic Communities and Violence. So if one way to think about that is about what I'm going to try to do today is to explain that rather complicated title, the Fundamentalist Mindset, Totalistic Communities and Violence. But I'm very honored, really, to be able to speak with you. I've always felt that if you want to understand something, you need to listen to the wisdom of the survivor and to try to understand, to direct your inquiry from within the experience of those who have suffered from the violence inherent in topics like this. The last book I did, my most recent book, was on the survivors of 9/11, Until the Fire Stopped Burning, and I spent many years talking to survivors. So talking to you is both, I think, intellectually, spiritually, but also morally, the way in which one should engage this kind of conversation. So to think about, and I want to, I don't know exactly how long I'll talk for a while, and then we can have some conversation and some questions. So to begin with the first part of my title of my talk, the fundamentalist mindset, now, which raises the question of fundamentalism. And I think fundamentalism is it's kind of a global epidemic of fundamentalism, which is most noisy in religions, certainly in the Abrahamic faiths, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, but also in many smaller faiths around the world. It manifests itself in rural Alabama and Tehran and the West Bank and Islamabad and many other parts between and beyond those places. And we see it. I've been particularly interested not in a given expression within a religion, any given religion of fundamentalism, but have been more impressed with the similarities across very different kinds of religious experiences in which one sees the growth of fundamentalism, which has really sort of startled the world. I mean, scholars didn't even begin to think seriously about this until the late 1980s and into the 1990s. But I think it's also important to realize that while fundamentalism, so-called, manifests itself most commonly within religions, it very definitely has either directly secular offshoots or sort of semi-secular offshoots, as with much of terrorism in the world, which has occupied a great deal of my attention in the last decade. So many observers would restrict the idea of fundamentalism to this context, specifically to the religious context, which I think tends to narrow, that focus tends to narrow our inquiry. And for example, it tends to privilege the fundamentalist approach to texts. And within Christianity, the idea that one can only be a true Christian if you follow the dictates of John 3:3, and within other kinds of faiths that you have to follow according to a read of a certain text, that's the only way one can be truly religious, however that is constructed. It seems to me there are several problems with this approach, which is the common approach to fundamentalism. One is that texts really don't, if you look at them closely, texts don't allow themselves to be examined or privileged in this kind of way. The Bible is really not a book. It's an encyclopedia written over 1,000 years by many authors with all kinds of internal contradictions. And so what happens is what's called a kind of a selective retrieval. That is, selected texts are then pulled out of the sacred scriptures and then given exaggerated significance. It's the only way one can say this is what says the way we should act, even though there are lots of contradiction within that. Furthermore, the most important texts for fundamentalists are ones that absolutely defy literalism, like in Christianity, the book of Revelation, which is a wild story of violence and craziness and things happening in sevens and ending up with the creation in heaven and earth. You cannot interpret that text literally. So and incidentally, that is it means that those in these communities who can supposedly interpret a wild and exotic and metaphorical text like that gain a special status. I will come back to that. Furthermore, some traditions like Hinduism has 30,000 sacred texts. So how could you possibly say that a literal approach is going to give us the true way define the true path that we should follow? And furthermore, many examples of fundamentalism by any criteria occur in contexts which are not religious at all, particularly cults, which has, as Jody mentioned, has been something that I've been very involved with for many years. I'm a historian, but I'm also a psychoanalyst, and I've not been formally involved in counseling people coming out of cults, but in the course of the last 25 years, I've had a number of, because people hear about me, I've had a number of people who have gotten out of cults who then want psychotherapy. So it seems to me it's a dead end to think about fundamentalism in terms of literalism, in terms of interpreting texts in this way. So I think it's much more fruitful to think, rather than about some sort of objective definition, well, not objective, but in any way, a definition of fundamentalism that focuses on text, to think rather about a fundamentalist mindset In other words, to think about it psychologically in order to try to grapple with what's happening about those who then move toward literalism, who create totalistic communities, who are ask instead what is happening psychologically in people who move toward these kinds of communities that are so fraught with the potential for violence. And I'd mentioned 5 aspects, and I'll talk about each of them separately, but 5 mindset: dualism, paranoia and rage, apocalypticism, charismatic leadership, and a totalized conversion. So let me take these in order. Dualism is the tendency in the fundamentalist mindset to create categories of good and evil, self and other, that are loaded with all kinds of value judgments. That is a highly normative way of thinking psychologically about the world. And it's absolutely essential to those who adopt the fundamentalist mindset, so that I am good and you are bad. I embody the essence of good, depending on how far down the spectrum this tendency to think in this way goes. But it loads evil onto the other. And the other is then constructed as the embodiment of evil. That tends in a collective way to create within cultures what a colleague and my mentor, Robert J. Lifton, who some of you may know from his many writings, that Lifton has called the designated victim. So that cultures, you certainly see tendency toward dualism within individuals, but cultures tend to embody evil in one designated victim. So in European history, the designated victim is obviously the Jew. In the American experience, the designated victim are the blacks. You can have lots of forms of prejudice, lots of forms of ethnic, racial rivalry, but a culture usually can only sustain one designated victim, which becomes enormously significant when you have massive historical crises like World War II and the Holocaust, because then the designated victim becomes the target of collective violence. And it leads, either at the collective level or at the individual level, sort of psychologically, once you establish these dualistic categories, once they are established, then inherent in the process is the idea, which is both ethical and political, the idea that the other can be dispensed with. Once the other is constructed as the embodiment of evil, then that other is almost required, depending on the context, to be dispensed with. That's why dualism, as part of the mindset, has within it always this potential for violence. Now, it may or may not be realized, but it has that because of this category of loading the other with violence and opening up the possibility for dispensing with the other. It means that it is an inherent potential for violence. No, that's not a question. That's out in the hall. So secondly, I think a really crucial characteristic of the fundamentalist mindset is paranoia. Paranoia and rage, but let me take paranoia first. Once you establish in your mind, say individually or collectively, once you establish that the other is evil and you are good, then that evil is a threat. It's a threat to your life. It's a threat to your existence. It's a threat to your being, and it lends itself to the establishment of, all too readily, of a kind of a paranoid approach to the other, to imagining all kinds of evil things about the other because you've already constructed it. As people going back, actually, psychoanalysts back to the 1930s have always noted, most people who have worked on aspects of paranoia have noted that there's a very important element or aspect of projection within it, so that the evil that one endows the other with usually comes from a sense of badness within the self. And that's why psychologically, if you work with paranoiacs, as I do sometimes in my practice. They tend not to stay in psychotherapy very long because you know who gets established as the evil other. But I have worked with them. There's a very sense of intimate knowledge, self-knowledge of the other who is the tormentor out to get one, because an important part of the process of establishing that other comes from within the self. So that kind of paranoia can also get embedded within group settings, within what I would call the group self, or what a colleague of mine, psychoanalyst in Chicago, calls the paranoid gestalt, that is sort of built into the self, that is capable, kind of like the fight-flight mechanism, right? And it's embodied in the self and able to be activated during moments of historical crisis. But I think one could also extend that to think about the idea of a paranoid gestalt as existing certainly within history, as within groups, but also in institutional kinds of settings that many of you are very familiar with, that all too readily establishes that kind of paranoia, which in turn is intimately related to rage. And I think paranoia and rage are almost two sides of the same coin, even if they're quite different psychologically. Rage is very definitely distinguished from aggression. Rage is uncontrolled, without a target. One experiences the object of rage as a flaw in one's narcissistic universe, not someone who is a true other who has an autonomous, independent sense of self. And that sense of fury and rage at the tormentor can then lead to many fantasies and actions of revenge. I'm actually writing a paper about rage, doing some research on it with a group, and I've been, along with my wife and college-age daughter, we've been watching movies in the last 3 weeks that all deal with this sort of rage and revenge. And it's very interesting. It's like half the movies coming out of Hollywood are built around this theme. It's really quite astonishing. You know, Falling Down, Taken, Fatal Attraction, Braveheart, and last night we were watching Carrie, which is a kind of science fiction version of the same theme. It's quite striking. All right, 3, the apocalyptic. Now, the apocalyptic is something that has occupied me for many years. First book I wrote on it was in 1994. I've written a couple of books since then about then. And I've been struck in thinking about the fundamentalist mindset. Thinking about fundamentalism from a psychological point of view is that it almost always, but it's not necessarily dualistic, not always and mostly paranoid, usually filled with a lot of rage, but it is always apocalyptic. There is always within that mindset a sense of the scale, a hoped for scale of transformation, ultimate kinds of transformation, radical endings that lead to radical new beginnings. And the apocalyptic narrative is, in this sense, a kind of a survivor tale. A radical, perverted, horrible survivor tale. But it is a tale that everybody evil, all those evil others, everybody bad has to die. And there has to be rivers of blood. And out of that, the redeemed are saved. So the sort of endings are beginnings. And it's I think the Ur text for, not just for Christianity, but for the other religions in the world, is the book of Revelation. So the fourth aspect, dimension, category within the fundamentalist mindset is what I call charismatic leadership. And many of you who know from personal experience how important the role of the leader in the setting, the institutional, the individual, the familial, the cultural setting, the role of the leader is in shaping the course of the group and the group leading to often tragic examples of violence. I think from Jim Jones to Bin Laden to Adolf Hitler to Nurse Ratched, the fundamentalist mindset thrives in this context of a powerful, paranoid, and usually charismatic leader. And there's some, Anthony Storr has named some very interesting characteristics of the charismatic leader in this context. And usually they possess a special spiritual insight. They claim to possess a special spiritual insight based on personal revelation, which is a vision that they also promise to followers. They claim to have been granted that special insight from some sort of divine authority, which has personally transformed their own life. From that experience, they tend to generalize as their insight being true, or their experience of revelation being true for all humanity, which is under an obligation to accept their vision. That they, when the last trump sounds and the last trumpet is blown, they and their followers will be saved. More specifically, psychologically, charismatic leaders like this tend to be isolated as children. They seldom have close friends. They tend to be introverted and deeply narcissistic. And they're completely intolerant of criticism, believing that anything less than total agreement with them is equivalent to hostility and antagonism. They tend to be elitist and anti-democratic. And a very interesting observation that Anthony Storr made, such leaders attract disciples without acquiring friends. And the relationship between the leader and followers is one of friendship, not one of friendship, but one of dominance, which of course fits with the paranoid cast of most such leaders. They don't discuss their ideas, they impose their ideas on their followers and disciples. Their own personal insight revelation comes usually after a period of mental stress or physical illness. Within the context of the group that they dominate, they possess charisma, although, as Weber pointed out long ago, charisma is in the eye of the beholder, so it's unclear exactly what we mean by charisma, but at least one can say in the context of the group, the following, the institution, the culture, they tend to have that ability to impose themselves. Given their personality structures, they need disciples as much as disciples in the context of oppression and totalism in the community, as much as the disciples experience their need for the followers. So there's this synergy that exists once this totalistic community gets established. It's intoxicating to be adored, and it's increasingly difficult as the process intensified, and I'm going to return to this question of the process. As the process intensifies, it's increasingly intoxicating to be adored, which creates a kind of a dynamic of radicalization and a push toward the extreme because of these dynamics between leader and followers. And finally, there's a very important characteristic, often a tragic characteristic of the way in which leaders interact within these communities, and that is there's a tendency to move toward radical experimentation with sexuality. That has led to that is a very important part of the guru, so-called, or the charismatic leader. Now, that last point about the radical experimentation, I want to give just an example. Actually, I mentioned to Jody this woman, Amy Siskin, who unfortunately was too damaged by her experience. I was hoping she could speak to you as well. I recommended to Jody. She did her PhD dissertation I was on her committee partly under my direction, and she took a lot of courses from me back in the 80s. But there was a psychotherapy cult, the most important psychotherapy cult in America was in New York City, from the 60s to the 80s. It was destroyed by AIDS. Free love, sex with everybody was not only allowed, it was encouraged. The idea was to break the bond of what they understood conceptually or theoretically. Their read of psychoanalysis was the tyranny of the bond between mother and child. So they started this sort of free love up in the Upper West Side on 91st and between Riverside and West End was where they had the home, and it had all the trappings of a psychoanalytic institute. It has a senior analyst, and it had people in training, and you were taken. You could not establish bonds. You carried around a little book, and you kept a list of who you slept with that night, and you had to be a different person every day. You didn't have to have sex every night with somebody different, but most nights. And if you decided you wanted, and the children were kept separately, it had all the trappings of a cult and great damage that it caused to people. Anyway, Amy wrote the Sullivan Institute, Fourth Wall Community, the relationship of radical individualism and authoritarianism, and that's the book that she wrote from her dissertation. And I think it's the most, given the incredible and tragic, unfortunate number of examples of this kind of radical experimentation with sex in totalistic sexuality in totalistic communities. This is one of the most dramatic and best documented. Needless to say, they fell apart with AIDS. So after 1982, the cult very quickly disintegrated. Now, briefly, I just want to say something about totalized conversion. There is a sense as people enter into these communities, and I don't have time to elaborate on this, but there is a sense of self-transformation as one adopts the values and way the constructions, the social constructions within whatever the group is, extreme family situations, cults, institutions, whatever, and that's why people that love bombing of the Moonies, which they hang out at the bus station and they target people who are vulnerable, because people who are then seduced into cults, for example, are themselves vulnerable and capable of experiencing the kind of self-transformation in a conversion process, and then adopt all the values of the group. Now, just a word about totalism, and that's the other part of the title of what I think is so important to understand. All of these things, all of these aspects, these dimensions of what I'm calling the fundamentalist mindset exist on a continuum, and they may or may not be absolute and totalized. But once they're totalized, once they are absolute and radical and totalized, that's when the groups and the institutions and the cults have the greatest propensity to move toward violence and abuse. Because it so separates that process, so intensifies what is not within the outside culture, and however influenced very definitely by the presence and the personality and the beliefs of the leader can give shape to this. Now, Jody asked me particularly to think about, or to try to raise some questions in my talk about how one can begin to identify when within institutions or groups how can you identify the points at which violence is more likely to occur than in the beginning? And my answer, I thought a lot about this, and she posed this question to me, to be sure to include that in my talk, and that's why I want to emphasize this sort of totalism. Although one can't be overly concrete or precise, but I want to emphasize that it's a process. People don't walk into a cult and overnight adopt mass suicide, as they did in Jim Jones in Guyana, right? You don't overnight get socialized into an extreme situation where you're going to create abuse and even murder. But the process is very seductive, and forms of, say, sexual transgression can become ritualized. This is something that many cults, from Jones to Shoko Sahara and Aum Shinrikyo in Japan, they became masters of ritualizing the forms. What begins as a form of experimentation becomes then a ritual that is imposed on everybody, and you have to participate, which then changes your personal experience and your relationship to the group. And the further that kind of experience proceeds, or Waco, Texas would be another good example, the further that moves, then there's an embrace, a collective embrace of the paranoid ideas, the dualistic categories of self and other, of evil being outside the group, that we embody goodness and holiness, and everything that's outside of our little group, our institution, our cult, is inherently evil, and anyone who departs within the group from the norms, from these psychological norms that get established, then can be dispensed with, and in its most extreme case, should be dispensed with. Therefore, there becomes an obligation. In its most extreme form, the idea of dispensing with the other becomes not just a possibility, but an obligation. So, for example, to give an historical example, consider the Nazis. Certainly wildly apocalyptic, aiming to create a 1,000-year Reich. All kinds of malevolent ideas about Jews and gypsies and homosexuals and all kinds of people who were, their term was life unworthy of life, which is an incredible idea when you think about it. But that was the construct. But the Nazis didn't begin as a killing project. It moved gradually into it. They started killing people in the 30s, but actually the first group they killed were deformed babies. Then they were killing schizophrenics in hospitals, and they were actually the first crematoria were in Munich at the end of a psychiatric ward. And it was only when the war started that they began to start killing the sort of Polish intellectuals, Jews, as the army moved east once the war started with Russia. And they only embarked on the final solution in 1942. The war started in 1939. So it fed on itself. The violence, the destructiveness, the desire to kill, to purify through killing, fed on itself and became a process. And there's no one date when one can, like what the Nazis can say, but I think, along the lines of Jody's question, I think the war, the beginning of the war, is what proved crucial for that particular moment in the vast killing fields that were created, which of course includes the Holocaust. To take a cult example, one sees certainly potentials for violence from the very beginning in Jim Jones when he was in Indiana, but really it was only after he moved to California that he started beating people up who tried to leave the cult. And of course, the most extreme case was when they moved to Guyana, because they were about to be exposed in the magazines. So I think one general sort of couple just conclusions, fundamentalist mindset emerges out of humiliation and trauma, but then creates situations and communities that inflict trauma on its victims. So it becomes this sort of very tragic process, a dog eating its tail, and one needs to understand sort of both ends, appreciate certainly the destructiveness, but also appreciate how the communities themselves emerge out of a process of their own kind of sense of humiliation and trauma. So can we escape that? Of course we can. We can escape it in shared experiences, in meetings like this, in creating new, open, and empathic communities that will inevitably create hope and healing. So, bless you all. Thanks.